What's up, everybody? We are kicking off a brand new series, and we are going to be talking about waiting. Now, for some of you, when you think about waiting, you immediately cringe and you're like, I hate waiting. So do this for me real quick. Pause this video and talk about something that you hate to wait for. All right, pause this video. So for some of you, you might have said like a ride at an amusement park. You might have said Christmas morning, you can't fall asleep, Christmas Eve. For some of you, that little typing icon on your messages when you're texting someone and they text back and then it never shows up. Maybe for some of you, graduation day, you can't wait to graduate, to go off to college, or at least to get out of the house. Some of you, a coffee order, Starbucks takes way too long. Maybe for some of you, vacation. You are so ready for summer to be here so you can be done with school and you're just waiting for it, right? Sometimes waiting can feel like an eternity because it's something that we really, really want. And so let me ask you this question though. Have you ever heard of this Stanford marshmallow experiment? Some of you might have heard about it, but in the 1970s, they're studying this idea called delayed gratification. And what happened was they put a kid in a room and they put a marshmallow in front of them and they said, hey, you can eat this marshmallow, but if you wait 10 minutes, I'll come back, and if you didn't eat it, I will give you another marshmallow so you can have 2 marshmallows. And the kids in the experiment were tracked over a course of years to see what kind of decisions they would make as they got older. So based on their decision during that experiment, and then see how it correlated with the decisions they made throughout life. And the goal was to see if the kid who waited for the second marshmallow had better lives or made better choices than the kids who didn't and choose to just go ahead and eat the first marshmallow. And the experiment had a ton of different conclusions and mixed results, and is actually pretty debated to this day, but it's well known, and a lot of times people reenact it or redo it again. So take a look at this clip and you can kind of see.
The famous Stanford marshmallow experiment tests children's self-control. You have a choice. You can eat it now, totally cool, or if you can wait till I get back, I'll give you a second marshmallow.
I can do it.
You can wait 10 minutes?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Oh, by the way, if you want, you can use that cup to cover it up so you don't have to look at it. Good luck.
Okay.
Researchers showed that by putting a marshmallow in front of a kid and daring him not to eat it, you could tell if one day they'd be the next Steve Jobs or the next Steve Gutenberg.
Oh.
Now, in the original experiment, they just waited to see what happened, but I don't have the patience for that. This is painful to watch. All right. Oh, you ate it. That's okay.
I didn't eat it. I lifted the cup and it was gone.
How'd you do?
Good.
Was it good?
Yeah. After I slipped the cup, it just disappeared.
What disappeared?
The marshmallow.
Would you like another one?
Yeah, it just disappeared.
Oh, buddy, here. You want to eat this one? It's okay. Here, eat this one. You can eat this one. It disappeared like magic?
Yeah.
Well, eat this one. Tell me how it tastes.
Good.
Is it good? Well, we made a kid cry, so I'd say phase 1 was a success.
So what about you? What do you think? You think you could have waited for the second marshmallow, or would you just go ahead and eat the marshmallow? And some of the conclusions were a little confusing and controversial because designers of the original study thought they had this figured out. Like when the kid waited for the second marshmallow, they believed it was because he had great self-control and that he wanted that second marshmallow. And as a result, later in life, he would grow up and make better decisions. But later versions of this same experiment showed something that was kind of important as well. They didn't choose to eat the marshmallow because they were impatient. They chose to eat the marshmallow because they didn't trust the stranger in the room that said they were going to bring them a second marshmallow. And so for many of the kids of the study, their decision not to wait for the second one wasn't based out of this lack of self-control, but maybe instead it was a lack of trust. And has anyone ever made a promise to you before in life? And they said, hey, maybe I'll promise to do something later down the road, or maybe I will do something for you or help you with something, or simply show up and spend time with you. And at first, waiting is kind of fun, right? There's anticipation because it builds, and when it's finally over, you're going to get the thing that you've been wanting. But again, what happens when the promise gets delayed, right? And then delayed again, and then delayed again. And then soon you're starting to wonder if it's ever going to happen at all, or you should just give up hope. And it's a feeling that all of us, I think, can identify with. And for some of us, it's because we've been waiting on God. In our lives, in our faith, there's a lot of things that we wish that could happen instantly. We wish we could pray a prayer and then it would immediately happen. And there's some promises we want fulfilled like right away, and we don't want to wait for it. But instead, a lot of times, we have to wait for it. And waiting on a promise places us somewhere between now and not yet. And while we wait, a lot can happen. We might get frustrated. We might ask questions. We might wonder if the person who made the promise can actually be trusted. And we also might be tempted to just give up. And when we're waiting on God to fulfill a promise, we might think this: can God really be trusted? We might think, does God actually care? Why is he making me wait this long? Can God even see me? And if God really loves me, why do I have to wait this long for something to happen? If you feel like you're waiting on God right now, the good news is you're not alone. The Bible is filled with stories of people who had been waiting on God for a long time. And for the next few weeks, we're going to explore 4 stories in Scripture about people who had to wait on God. And if you didn't grow up in church, these stories and characters might be brand new, but don't worry, we'll keep you updated and catch you up. And if you grew up in church, you might have heard these stories as a kid, but really don't necessarily know what they really mean. We're often told simplified versions of the stories to kids, but as we get older, when we revisit these stories, they seem a little more complex, full of tension, more interesting, and maybe more unknown than what we thought we knew. And so most biblical stories highlight the moments where characters fail and come to the end of themselves. And today we'll see how important biblical figure named Abram waited on God. Then he gave up waiting on God, but then he eventually learned something vital about God's character. So Abram, who was later called Abraham, is known as the father of Judaism in Christianity. He's the guy God worked with thousands of years ago in order to set a huge plan, a huge promise into motion. So pause this video, read Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. So Abram was this ordinary guy, but this wasn't an ordinary promise. This was a big promise for Abram. In those times, having children was a sign of God's blessing. So when God promised Abram a son, it was one of the greatest promises that Abram could have received. And this was also a big promise for the entire world, right? God promised to make Abram's descendants God's special chosen people, the Israelites, and the people through whom God would work and save the entire world and who he would be revealed through. But there was a problem. Abram didn't have any descendants, and his wife Sarai was unable to have children, and they both were pretty old, right? So you can kind of see that might be an issue. So if God's going to promise these things, but it doesn't look like it can happen, what? Like, you can imagine the questions and the doubts that they must have had. And Abram and Sarah, they obeyed God by packing up their lives. They hit the road. But that promise about a baby and babies, that was hard for them to trust. So pause this video, skip over a couple chapters, and read Genesis chapter 15, verses 1 through 6. So you see, Abram was stuck waiting to receive what God had promised. He didn't have a timeline. He didn't have a plan. He just had a promise. And I know for some of you, that's super frustrating. Like, you have to know when, you have to know the plan, you know how, you have to know everything. For some of you, you're more laid back and you're like, it will happen or whatever. But imagine having a promise, but no timeline. You don't know when it's happened. You're already pretty old and you're just questioning. So he was officially on the wait list. He was officially on the wait list. And after 10 years of waiting for a promise from God, they were still learning to trust, right? And I'm sure Abram and Sarah felt discouraged and impatient. And discouragement can often lead to times of doubt. And doubt can make us do questionable things sometimes. So they took matters into their own hands. Maybe you've done that before. You've waited, and you're finally like, forget this. I'm just going to do what I think is best. And that's what happens. And so the next chapter, Genesis chapter 16, we see what happens. So pause this video, read Genesis chapter 16, verses 1 through 6. See, remember how we just said that the Bible tells us about people who failed in big ways and that you shouldn't necessarily imitate the actions of biblical figures. Yeah, this would be one of those times, right? We're talking disobedience, lack of trust, mistreating Hagar, the servant, and the whole sleeping with the enslaved woman in order to have a baby kind of thing. But you know what? Like, I kind of get it. Like, I don't know about that Sarah was trying to disobey God. I think she just had good intentions. She likely thought, well, I'm too old to have a baby, and it doesn't seem or make sense that God could use me. So maybe God's waiting on me to come up with another plan. Maybe he's just waiting me to figure it out. And Sarah might have thought she was just helping God out, and when her plan came to fruition, it not only ended with a baby, but it ended with jealousy. It ended with another woman becoming pregnant with a son named Ishmael. And Sarah struggled with jealousy, and that jealousy led to cruelty towards Hagar. And ultimately, Sarai's plan backfired. See, God had promised her tons of descendants, but she didn't trust that God would come through on that promise. And after 25 years of waiting for God's plan, Sarah gave birth to Isaac, the promised son. But here's the really amazing thing. God did not only fulfill the promise to Abraham and Sarai, God even showed them grace by blessing the son Abraham had fathered out of disobedience. And we see in Genesis 17 that God could have punished and even abandoned Abraham and Sarah, but instead God covered them with grace. And it's kind of like they ate their first marshmallow, but God gave them two anyway. And the Bible doesn't really spell out every detail for us in the story. It leaves room for us to question and kind of wonder. So I wonder, like those kids in the marshmallow experiment, did God understand that Abram and Sarah's disobedience wasn't out of maybe a lack of self-control? Did God see it as they really didn't trust him? And is that why God chose to give them grace instead of judgment? Because what they really needed was punishment, but assurance that God would or could be trusted. Like, I don't know what promises you're waiting on God right now to fulfill, or which promises you'll need to wait for in the future, but here's what I do know. God can be trusted. God can be trusted. There's a great book in the Bible called Proverbs that gives us some wisdom, and it helps us understand and how to live our lives. And it's cool because it has 31 chapters. So you could read a proverb a day for most of the months and become wise and wise and wise. But one of the most famous proverbs is found in chapter 3. So pause this video, read Proverbs chapter 3, verses 5 and 6. See, like Abraham and Sarah, who waited for years for God to give them a child, here's the message you and I often need to hear. And here's the bottom line. God has a plan, but we might have to wait for it. God has a plan, but we might have to wait for it. See, when God makes a promise, the plan God has in mind is better than anything that you and I could imagine. But guess what? Sometimes it's difficult to see where things are heading. And while we wait, guess what? It can become complicated. And it can become, when is this going to happen? We could begin to question. And we might think we know what's best or what's next, but we often have no idea. So what are you waiting for right now? Like, what are you waiting for right now? Is it something to change in your life? Maybe something to change in your heart? Maybe a new opportunity, a prayer that you've been praying to be answered, a problem to be solved. Waiting is often very difficult and usually goes on for much longer than we would actually prefer. But here's what we can learn from the story of Abraham and Sarah. While we're waiting, God can be trusted. God can be trusted. While we're waiting, we don't have to figure it all out. While we're waiting, God knows the future way better than we do. While we're waiting, God's plan is far greater than anything that we could hope for or imagine. And while we're waiting, even though we get tired of waiting, God never gets tired of being gracious and compassionate towards us. So no matter what you're waiting for, I hope you remember that God can be trusted. And the same God who is so patient, gracious, and trustworthy to Abraham and Sarah is patient and gracious and trustworthy to you and to me. So we don't always know what God wants us to wait for or how long it will take to get there. But we know this, God has a plan, even if we have to wait for it. So I hope you have a great rest of your week. I hope you have awesome time in small group as we talk more about this.